Welcome to Mehdi Unfiltered here in Washington, D.C. I'm Mehdi Hasan. On today's show, I'll talk with a member of Palestine's Christian community about Israel's most recent strike on his community in Gaza and the loss of his loved ones. I'll also talk to a Gold Star father about Trump's visit to Arlington Cemetery and why the former president's blatant disrespect towards dead soldiers is frankly nothing new. But first, let's talk about one of Trump's most fascistic plans for 2025, using the military to crush dissent. So, what are we waiting for? Let's go. A friend of mine said to me recently that if Trump wins, it won't be the end of the world because, quote, we can organize and protest like we did last time. And I said to them, but unlike last time, this time around, second-term Trump plans to crack down on any protests against him. He plans to put the military on the streets. My friend looked at me like I was crazy, like I was just being silly or exaggerating, like I had Trump derangement syndrome. It's a look that I get a lot from people, even on the left, even from anti-war activists, when I say Trump is a threat to our right to peaceful protest, to free assembly, to free speech. And, fascist that he is, he plans to use the US military against us, against those of us who want to demonstrate or dissent. Now, people may not want to believe this, but it's not a conspiracy theory, nor is it a secret. There have been multiple reports, you may have missed them, that the Trump team plan to invoke what's called the Insurrection Act in order to put troops on the streets of this country and to target them at their critics. The New York Times reported last month on how Trump would use soldiers against riots, crime, and migrants. The Washington Post, late last year, reported on how Trump's advisors have discussed deploying the military to quell potential unrest on Inauguration Day. Critics have called the ideas under consideration dangerous and unconstitutional. Yeah, because they are. Now you might say, well, that's just the liberal media, the Trump-hating media, the fake news, exaggerating the threat from Trump, engaging in hyperbole about military crackdowns for clicks. Trump wouldn't actually do it. Trump can't do it. This is America. And yet, in his first term, Donald Trump asked his defense secretary, Mark Esper, during the George Floyd protests in the summer of 2020, when peaceful protesters were outside the White House, to shoot at those protesters, to have the military open fire on them. Esper, of course, told Trump he couldn't do that, but next time around, when a second-term Trump tells his defense secretary to have the US military open fire on peaceful protesters, there won't be an Esper to say no. There'll be a Trump sycophant, a Kash Patel, a Rick Grenell, a Michael Flynn as defense secretary, saluting the Donald and saying, yes, sir, whatever you say. Now, you might say, well, Mark Esper is just a disgruntled ex-Trump official. He's a never-Trumper. Even though as someone who literally served in Trump's cabinet, he is by definition not a never-Trumper. But even if you don't believe the fake news media, even if you don't believe Mark Esper, how about believing Russ Vought, who was Trump's loyal director of the Office of Management and Budget, is one of the brains behind Project 2025 and is even now being touted as a possible White House chief of staff in a second Trump administration. Here is Vought speaking in private to people he thought were representatives for a right-wing billionaire donor, but were in fact reporters for the British non-profit, the Centre for Climate Reporting, and who were secretly recording him. Here is what Russ Vought said about Trump and his fascistic plan to use the military against protesters when he thought you and I couldn't hear him.
It's vital that the president has the authority to maintain law and order, and he does. And our view is we put out, for instance, a 50-page paper designed for lawyers to know that the president has the ability both along the border and elsewhere to maintain law and order with the military, and that's something that it's going to be important for him to remember and his lawyers to affirm. But we've given them the case for that.
That's using the military rather than the police, is it?
Wow. Well, not as the police necessarily, but you shouldn't be having to worry about governors giving you permission to maintain law and order.
Vought says there that he and his group of authoritarian think tankers, he and his Project 2025 gang, have given the Trump team a 50-page paper making the legal case for the president using the military against ordinary Americans to, quote, maintain law and order. That is what is heading our way. That is authoritarianism 101. That is fascism. 101. It's also a recipe for civil war. Vote says there that Trump won't have to worry about governors giving him permission to send in the troops. Stephen Miller, another close ally of Trump who's expected to get a big job in a Trump second term, has been explicit about what will happen when Trump uses the military to round up and detain undocumented migrants, for example. Quote, "You go to the red state governors and you say, 'Give us your National Guard,'" Miller explained on a right-wing podcast late last year. "We will deputize them as immigration enforcement officers. The Alabama National Guard is going to arrest illegal aliens in Alabama, and the Virginia National Guard in Virginia. And if you're going to go into an unfriendly state like Maryland, well, there would just be Virginia doing the arrest in Maryland, right? Very close, very nearby." Yes. Red state National Guards in a Trump second term could end up squaring off against blue state National Guards. That's what could be coming our way very soon. A recipe for literal civil war. In fact, Russ Vought said earlier in that secret recording that we showed you that the Trump team sees protests as part of a color revolution to overturn their rule, and they will respond accordingly. It's really creepy and disturbing. But it's what they believe and what they're saying in private to people who they think are their allies.
I think they will attempt a color revolution where they have riots, where they have everything you've seen in other countries.
Sorry, can you just unpack that just quickly?
Yeah, so their strategy is in the foreign policy community is to have the people of a disfavored regime riot, take to the streets, have non-government organizations say that the president should step down, focus media attention on it. It's a color revolution.
Gotcha.
And that's what we're worried about now, is that they would do that. And George Floyd obviously was not about race. It was about destabilizing the Trump administration. Right. What we saw during the riots, the burning, it's the left belief that structures in society are the problem as opposed to the human condition.
Yeah. And
so pulling society down for purposes of revolution is exactly what they want. And what you're seeing at college campuses is a part of that as well.
That's a top Trump ally, a guy likely to have one of the most senior jobs in a future Trump administration, comparing college campus protests, for example, against Israel's Gaza war right now, to a color revolution in Eastern Europe, to Georgia's Rose Revolution or Ukraine's Orange Revolution. It's insanely paranoid talk and insanely dangerous talk. So to those of you who think a Trump second term will look like a Trump first term, think again. To those of you who think talk of Trump deploying the military on the streets of American cities to crack down on protests is exaggerated, is hyperbolic, think again. To those of you who think it can't happen here, America is immune from the rise of fascism and the far right that we've seen across other parts of the world, other parts of the West, both right now and throughout history, think again. Yes, it can happen here. We could be facing a president in January of 2025 who is ordering American troops to open fire on American citizens. Don't take my word for it. Take theirs. Joining me now to discuss this are Rosa Brooks, professor of law at Georgetown, a former advisor in the Obama Defense Department, and an expert on civil-military relations. She wrote a piece for the New Republic in May on the military in a fascist America. Jason Stanley is a professor of philosophy at Yale University, an expert on authoritarianism, and author of the new book, Erasing History, How Fascists Rewrite the Past to Control the Future. Jason, Rosa, thank you for joining me on Mehdi Unfiltered. Rosa, let me go to you first. You have studied this stuff. You've been part of simulations about what will happen should Trump win a second term. You know this stuff better than most when it comes to the military. When Trump and his acolytes say they're going to invoke the Insurrection Act on day one to use the military against protesters, there's nothing legally to stop them from doing that, is there?
That's essentially true. We have legislation that gives the President of the United States essentially unlimited discretion to say there's an insurrection or other kinds of emergency, including to invoke the U.S. military to allow them to engage domestically. There are very few limits on that. Courts have essentially found in the past that it's entirely up to the president how to define an insurrection. So you and I might say, well, that's not an insurrection, that's a peaceful protest, but there's no reason to believe believe that courts would intervene to stop a President Trump or any authoritarian president, even if they were clearly misusing that power.
The irony, of course, Rosa, of Republicans who denied an actual insurrection was an insurrection. It was just tourists using the Insurrection Act against actual peaceful protesters. You might think, Rosa, that Democrats should have maybe amended the law, seeing this was coming down the line?
You might think so, and there have been some efforts to do exactly that, but so far they haven't gone anywhere. I mean, and honestly, both parties are to blame for that. I think one thing that we've seen in general with executive power is that it's easy to criticize executive power when you're the party that does not hold the White House, but Democrats as well, once they get into the White House, have tended to go, well, it's not a big deal. We would, of course, use these powers responsibly, yes. So let them persist until the day you get somebody who's not acting in good faith.
Which is, of course, Donald J. Trump. Jason Stanley, you were one of the people warning about Trump's fascistic tendencies back in term one. There are people who think it can't get any worse. How much worse could another Trump term be, I hear people say. But Trump is saying he'll use the military against his opponents in term two. And again, as I asked Rosa, there's no real legal way of stopping him. Politically, do you think there's any way of stopping him?
Well, I mean, we faced this for the last 5 years or longer, this inability to take Trump at his word. It's true that Trump lies a lot, but he usually does what he says he's going to do. This is something he wanted to do before, invoke the Insurrection Act in response to the Black Lives Matter movement. He was prevented from so doing. We know in a second term, or I don't like to call it a second term because will stay in until he dies, but when he's elected again, and remains in power, of course he will use the military to crush dissent. Why wouldn't he?
And it's interesting, you just mentioned, Jason, there, he wanted to do it during the George Floyd protest. We just played a clip of Mark Esper saying, as defense secretary at the time, Trump said, can't you just shoot them in the legs? And he was like, no. Next time round, there won't be an Esper to say no. There won't be the infamous adults in the room, will there, Jason?
That's the whole point. We know that. Everyone knows what they're voting for. They're voting for an autocrat who's going to use all the devices at his power to remain in power. So none of this should be a surprise unless you think America is somehow immune from what happens everywhere else in the world. Is there politically, the time to stop it is right now?
Yes, indeed. Rosa, let's talk about liberals and their attitude and their preparedness for this. Are liberals really ready for what Trump could do with the military? Because you wrote about the, quote, liberal fantasy, the idea that the U.S. military will somehow save us from Donald Trump. Far from saving us from Trump, Rosa, they could be the tool, the weapon he uses to crush all dissent as authoritarians have in other countries, as Jason just noted, right? We're not exceptional to this.
No, we're not exceptional. I completely agree with Jason. I think one thing that Americans tend to think is that somehow bad things that happen in other places couldn't possibly happen here, but we are not immune from the forces of history. I think that there's good news and there's bad news when it comes to the military. The good news is that the U.S. military has very deeply internalized norms against getting involved in domestic politics. They've also deeply internalized norms relating to the law and obeying lawful orders and civilian control of the military. That's the good news. The downside of that is that they're going to follow orders unless those orders are clearly illegal. So if you get a President Trump and he does something that is, to use the phrase that we like to use, lawful but awful, military personnel are not going to say, well, sir, that's a bad idea, so I'm not going to do it. If he gives an order that's manifestly unlawful, if he says, shoot that unarmed peaceful protester, no problem. I think military personnel will have no difficulty and no hesitation about saying, no, sir, I can't do that. That's illegal. But if you're at all savvy, and I think a second Trump administration will be a lot savvier than the first Trump administration, that's not the form the orders come in. The orders come in the form of, we have checked this out with our helpful lackeys in the Office of Legal Counsel of the Justice Department, and everything is fine, and is perfectly okay, go ahead. And quite frankly, depending on precisely the way the Trump administration has framed their authorities, it probably would be lawful. So I think the use of the military in and of itself would be perfectly lawful if Trump invokes it. the rubber will hit the road over things like rules of engagement. Exactly what is the military being told to do? And so I think anybody who thinks that the military is going to say, no, we refuse to deploy as ordered is pretty delusional. The military will abide by lawful orders. That being said, I do think that if a Trump administration attempts to order military personnel to do things that would themselves be clear violations of the rule during that deployment, such as shoot unarmed protesters, then I do think you would get a lot of resistance from the military, as you should, because military officers take an oath to the Constitution, and all military personnel have an obligation to abide by the law of the land, which includes the Uniform Code of Military Justice.
But Rosa, you mentioned military personnel several times, they're military officers. Isn't it also the case that Donald Trump, you talk about lackeys in the DOJ, it's not that hard for him to put lackeys into the military. He's talked about my generals in the past. You wrote in your New Republic piece, quote, he can request the retirement of flag and general officers who show signs of independence, for instance, and dismiss those who don't take the hint, and he can make fealty to his agenda a condition of advancement for senior officers. And that's also part of the Project 2025 agenda as well, isn't it? Just purging the military of dissenting or independent voices.
Yes, absolutely. And the challenge that a Trump administration will face in carrying out their authoritarian threats is that there's sort of a trade-off between loyalty and, frankly, competence. They're going to inherit a military leadership that is not going to be super inclined to, actively further Trump's agenda. They can start purging people, but that's going to take time. The deeper down you go, you can only fire so many 4 stars before you run out of 4 stars. You can start promoting 3 stars. The further down you go, the more likely you are to get people who don't know how to work the levers of power themselves, don't know how the system operates. And so competence diminishes as loyalty goes up. And that is the tightrope that they're going to be walking. I actually think in terms of civil liberties and the fate of American democracy, that ironically, if Trump tries to do everything everywhere all at once, he is more likely to face significant blowback from inside the federal government and from the press and from the general public. If he is careful, slow, if it's the famous frog gradually raising the temperature. Frogs are way too smart for that. They totally jump out of the water. But humans, it turns out, are not that smart. We stay in the water. So if they go slow and steady, I actually think that we're in more danger if it's sort of a creeping authoritarianism than if they try to do everything all at once.
That's a very good point. Jason, there's been a lot of discussion about Project 2025, how close its authors are to Donald Trump, how much of a boost it is to Democratic Party electoral fortunes. Just in terms of its content, you're someone who's written extensively about fascism and especially fascist messaging. Is it fair to say that Project 2025 is a fascist project?
Well, it's a Christian nationalist version of fascism, oriented towards breaking down the church-state distinction. But yes, it encapsulates a concept from history called the Nazis. The concept of Gleichschaltung. Gleichschaltung, or coordination, is the process of replacing all organizations, such as the military, the schools, the courts, by loyalists. And this process of Gleichschaltung is very explicitly the aim of Project 2025. They aim to replace the civil service by Trump loyalists with questions determining loyalty. One can expect people who believe that the 2020 election was fraudulent, for example, that to be some sort of litmus test here. Yeah. So that process of replacing all neutral parties, bureaucracy, everything by party and Trump loyalists. That's like that has a specific name in the history of fascism. And it's just so interesting. I mean, if one can use that word, this talk of replacing competence by loyalty, because that too is a theme of the fascist literature. Hannah Arendt talks about that. There's a penalty to pay when you replace competent bureaucracies that follow specific rules and guidelines by loyalists. So, you can predict it from what loyalty is, the nature of loyalty, but it's also another concept there that's in the history and philosophy of fascism.
You're telling me General Michael Flynn won't be an efficient manager of the Pentagon? I'm shocked. Rosa, just on the white nationalist angle to all this, is it your view that Trump would want to use any purge of the military to make sure that white nationalists inside the military are not rooted out, are able to keep their jobs? Because the current Democratic defense secretary in this Democratic administration, Lloyd Austin, who is a black man and a former general, has spoken about the need to tackle white nationalism within the military's ranks. You'd think those are the kind of people that Trump might like to keep around.
I certainly don't think we're going to see an energetic effort to identify and eliminate white nationalism as a force within the U.S. military if Trump is elected. On the contrary, I think we're going to see the effort to ensure that we do not have military personnel who are themselves extremist white nationalists in the military is going to be replaced by an effort to purge the military of the sort of current MAGA bogeyman, which is wokeness. And any military officer, any military personnel, but particularly higher ranking officers who have expressed the opinion that it is important to have diversity within the U.S. military, who have expressed respect, for instance, for trans service members, or who have expressed the view that we need to be concerned about issues of race in the military or gender, et cetera. Those are the people who are going to find themselves in significant trouble, and that is certainly that's part of the Project 2025 playbook, has been to ensure that when it comes to officer promotions, particularly at the most senior level, that becomes one of the litmus tests for, do you get promoted or not? Have you ever said anything like, yeah, I don't know, critical race theory, there might be a few points there. You might find it rather difficult to get promoted under a Trump administration.
And we saw Matt Gaetz, the MAGA congressman, berating Mark Milley for precisely that at a hearing once. Jason, controlling the military is just one front in the fascist takeover. Your new book is called Erasing History: How Fascists Rewrite the Past to Control the Future. It's about how our institutions of higher education have become a battleground for the far right. It's their way of taking control of society. And we've seen that in Orban's Hungary. It's happening right now in America, though, isn't it? We don't have to wait for a Trump second term. It's already happening in places like Florida.
Oh, that's right. I mean, the New College of Florida has been entirely dismantled. They recently removed all the books in gender studies from their libraries, from the New College library, on the supposed grounds that the gender studies department had been eliminated. So we see this. We also see, concerningly, the normalization of militarized police directed against nonviolent student protests. So, this is the white moderate in Martin Luther King's sense, the people who think, okay, I'm not a Trump supporter, but it's totally okay to sic police on nonviolent anti-genocide protesters in universities. And that's what frightens me, is this normalization of violence directing Jason, against dissent. I mean, these kids are protesting an ongoing genocide, and Americans, not just Trump supporters, are saying, okay, it's totally normal to have.
So, Jason, on that basis, then, are you saying that liberals, moderates, Democrats, capital D Democrats, are complicit in the rise of fascism then, if they are also supporting, in places like New York, for example, where Kathy Hochul totally supported the police crackdown on Columbia students, which saw a police officer fire his weapon inside a hall?
Well, fascism doesn't win unless there's a lot of people who are complicit. You need the left, who say that the real enemy are the centrists. You need the centrists to normalize the fascist practices. The whole structure, the fascist practices against the left, in other words, tearing the center and the left apart. Those are things we are seeing right now. They're reminiscent of history. And the left and the center at each other's throat, while the far right, the forces of authoritarianism, are chuckling.
Rosa,
can I go back to
the
thing you said a minute ago, Mehdi, about whether are liberals prepared? I mean, I don't think the issue is really liberals and whether they're prepared, because there are a lot of people who don't consider themselves politically to the left, who are pro-democracy, who don't want to see an autocratic Trump administration come into power. And is that broader group of pro-democracy actors prepared? I think the answer to that is no. And together with the Brennan Center for Justice, we did a series of large-scale role-play simulation exercises earlier this summer, trying to game out how that would actually unfold if a Trump administration comes into office. it was very, very clear the pro-democracy forces were really struggled. They were uncoordinated. They were not prepared. As I think, unfortunately, is sort of typical in real life. Trump would be calling out the military, and the pro-democracy actors would be saying things like, "Well, let's write an op-ed in the New York Times," which not likely to mobilize the masses in any particularly effective way. I think that we all need to be taking extremely seriously the really concrete threats that do exist, and we cannot be waiting until after the election to start planning, because it will already be too late. We're already way behind. That if you want to be able to have organized, peaceful protests, for instance, if you want to have legal defense funds for people who may be unfairly targeted, if you want to be able to ensure that pro-democracy activists have access to good advice on cybersecurity, you name it, a communication strategy, those aren't things that we can start creating on the day after the inauguration. That those kinds of networks, the resources, those are all things that people need to be thinking about right now. In fact, 6 months ago, frankly. So I don't think we are prepared. I think we need to do a whole lot more. I also think that no matter who wins, just to go off Jason's point, no matter who wins this election, the forces of authoritarianism are not going to disappear overnight in this country. We're already seeing it at the state level. We're seeing it in Congress. We're seeing people get, local level, school board officials, election officials, you name it, getting doxxed and harassed and threatened in all kinds of really devastating ways for any kind of democratic institutions. That's not going to go away. So I think, frankly, that kind of work to support people who are standing up for democratic institutions, it's not going to be wasted no matter who wins the election. It's something we've all got to be engaged in.
Well said, and you're right, we are way too behind, which is why I wanted to have this discussion with you both today, so we can try and sound the alarm for our viewers and subscribers. Rosa Brooks, Jason Stanley, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your insights. Appreciate it. On Saturday, a day before the United Nations began carrying out its polio vaccination campaign in Gaza under agreed-upon pauses in the fighting, Israeli strikes managed to kill at least 61 people. One of those strikes hit a family home next to Gaza's St. Porphyrius Church, delivering yet another blow to the enclave's Christian community. Palestine is home to one of the oldest Christian communities in the world, dating back to the 1st century and to Philip the Evangelist from the New Testament. Before October the 7th, Gaza was home to around 1,000 Palestinian Christians and several Christian churches. I say was, as many of those Christians have now been killed by the Israeli military, and many of those churches were either damaged or destroyed by Israeli warplanes. One person who is sadly no stranger to Israel's violence against Palestinians, including Palestinian Christians, is Khalil Sayegh. His father and sister were both killed by Israel during its war on Gaza, and Saturday's strikes that killed more than 61 people also injured his other sister and his niece. As a political analyst and co-founder of the Agora Initiative, Khalil is also a former resident of both Gaza and the occupied West Bank, and he joins me now. Khalil, thanks so much for coming on Mehdi Unfiltered. I want to start by saying to you, obviously, how sorry we all are for your loss and all that you've lost since the start of this war, start of this genocide. And I want to first ask you about the condition of your loved ones who were injured at the weekend. How are they doing?
Well, thank you for having me, Mehdi. Thankfully, it's by miracle that they have survived, and their injury was light, actually. My sister was entering a room with my infant niece, literally walking into the room. And just before she got into this room, the room itself just collapsed. So it was just by a miracle that half she entered the room, that I would have lost another sister during this war. My niece, Maria, was injured in her forehead, and she had about 4 scratches here in her forehead.
How old is she?
So she's 7 at this point. My niece, Khizr, who is only 9 months, by miracle also survived, because his little bed literally had like 3 big rocks that fall from the room on the bed, but by miracle nothing happened to him.
And they survived, but unfortunately, earlier on in this conflict, you lost your younger sister and your father. What happened to them?
Yes, so in December 21st, I've lost my father to a medical condition that we really don't know. And the reason why we don't know what's the medical condition, Mehdi, is because there were no medical attention whatsoever at that time. 2 days before that, at the Catholic Church in Gaza, 2 women were shot, literally by Israeli snipers, into what Pope Francis has described as terrorism. During the same time, my father had either heart attack or a panic attack. We don't know what happened to him, but his health just start, getting worse and worse.
And you're saying you had no access to medical care?
Yeah, at that time, all hospitals, including Al Ahli Hospital, which is not far from the churches, Al Shifa Hospital, were destroyed by Israel. And the tanks were literally surrounding the church, Mehdi, not allowing ambulances to get in, not allowing doctors. And my father passed away. And until now, we don't know what is it that happened to him. Was it panic attack? Was it heart attack? So that was happened to my father. We worked hard to get my family out. And the day that we decided that my mother and my little sister are leaving was on April 24th. And it was the Passover for the Jewish people. And the Israeli military has decided to close the Netzarim corridor between the north and the south, causing a delay for them. Instead of leaving in the early morning, they left in the noon. Under a very, very harsh circumstances of the heat of the sun. My sister collapsed all of a sudden after walking about 7 kilometers, about 4 hours. We don't know what happened to her. All what we know is just she collapsed. She was left to die there at the
No medical care.
No medical care, and you're not allowed to have a car or a donkey or a bike at that time. And my friends, my Muslim
people
friends,
are just walking from north to south.
People are walking, and there is literally the quadcopters, drones, and in the air, and they know of many stories of people just looked behind them. And they were shot by the quadcopter. My sister had her bottle of water fall to the ground, and my mom was with her. And she told her, just grab it back. And she said, no, I would not grab it back because they will kill me. She kept walking, and all of a sudden she collapsed. And no one was allowed to even come get her body. My two Muslim friends on the other side came to rescue her. They were literally under Israeli fire, but they came. They took my sister. My mom was at a coma at that time. She had been out of conscious. They took her, and it was really something horrific that they went through.
It sounds absolutely horrific. And when I hear people like Eylon Levy, the former Israeli Prime Minister's former spokesman, saying people could just walk from north to south, he makes it sound like a casual stroll.
Yeah.
But it's a death march.
Yeah, it's a death march. Not only is it impossible for people to walk 7 kilometers in these circumstances and the heat, etc., it's also impossible for them not to feel the fear as the tanks are around you. People were being shot, people are being killed. But also Israel destroyed the roads. So we used to have a normal road right by the beach, but right now it's literally destroyed. It's just sand, and you have to walk like walking through the desert with a fear. But not only this, Mehdi, I can tell you, I have a friend of mine who was at the church walking down to the south. They stopped him for no reason. They took him to the side and they beat the hell out of him. And when he said, I'm Christian, I don't know about anything about Hamas, when they were asking about Hamas, they said, well, you Christians are even bigger problem, and beat him up even more. He said, why are we a bigger problem? He said, because of you, we weren't able to evacuate all the people from a Zaytun neighborhood, which is where the church was at.
I see. And in fact, on that note, you are part of Palestine's Christian community, Gaza's Christian community. A lot of people in the West were shocked to hear there were Christians in Gaza.
Yeah.
I spoke to Munther Isaac on this show a few weeks ago, who spoke about life in the occupied West Bank. He's from Bethlehem, for Palestinian Christians there. What has life been like all these years under siege, under blockade, for Palestinian Christians living in Gaza? Because the Israelis and their supporters in the West, they want to tell us that the threat to Palestine's Christians comes from Hamas, not from Israel. What is your response to that?
So even before the war, before more than 3% of the Christian population in Gaza were literally massacred by Israel, and what is the second biggest massacre against Middle Eastern Christians in the modern history, which is the bombing of St. Porphyrios Church on October 17th, where over 18 people were killed. Most of them are babies that were killed at the bombing of the church. Even before all of that, the main obstacles that Christians in Gaza were facing is the Israeli occupation, the fact of the siege, because it impacted our economy like our Muslim brothers and sisters, impacting our life. But even more than that, it even impacted our marriage and our demography. You know, we're a small community. We're less than 1,000 people in Gaza. We're allowed to only marry Christians. And there were almost no Christians to marry anymore, because we're just under the siege. No, you can't. And historically, we used to go to the West Bank. You can find a Christian woman, or if you're a woman, you can find a Christian man. But you can't do that. You can't go to Egypt because of the siege. You can't go anywhere. So that also we lost. But not only this, historically, from a religious point of view, the Christians of Palestine and the region used to go to Jerusalem every Easter, and they would go to Bethlehem every Christmas. We're not allowed to go through that as well. So all these difficulties, and by no means I'm saying that Hamas were angels and we were having, you know, full rights, whatever. But when it comes to Christian rights in Gaza from Hamas government, there were no really intervenants in that regard. However, the fact that they are an Islamist group have, to an extent, threatened our existence, because all of a sudden, the public square in Gaza became more Islamized. And when you have a sort of Islamist or any illiberal government changing the public square to one religious group, it is by nature that the minority will feel more threatened than before.
So I want to come back to Hamas. Before I do, just on this Christian point, you're describing the repression of a tiny minority Christian community in the Middle East, and yet silence from America's very powerful, very influential, very outspoken white Christian evangelical community. Why do you think that is? Why do you think American Christians have abandoned Palestinian Christians?
It is quite unfortunate that this is happening. I sometimes, Mehdi, feel that white evangelicals are more interested in the Christians to use them just as a pawns to sort of attack Muslims, to sort of strip Islamophobia. Yes. This is literally how I feel, because the only time I'm interested to hear about you, and you're right, it's when you are persecuted by the Muslims. But when you're persecuted by someone else, I'm not interested to hear from you. So I think this is how I describe generally the evangelical white elites. But the truth is, and I'll be honest with you, and I'm someone who traveled and spoke at many evangelical churches here in the US, from the south to the north, that your average evangelical Christian, even those who are white, tend to be really ignorant about these subjects. Yeah. And they don't know, but their elites are the one who manipulate them to believe certain things.
The polling shows that they think Palestine is occupying Israel.
Yeah, and when you really talk to them, you see them as really, like, honestly, they're sweet people, they're just ignorant.
And they have no idea that Bethlehem is under siege and restrictions.
No idea. And they've never been there. But when I talk to them and they know this, it changed them. And that's why I tend to approach them with compassion, just like I approach anyone else.
Let's come back to Hamas then. You've lived under Hamas rule?
I did.
And your fellow Palestinian Christians still live under Hamas rule. Right now, especially in the West, in the Palestinian diaspora, there is a kind of taboo against criticizing Hamas. Partly because there's a genocide going on, and the priority, many activists would argue, understandably, is focus on what Israel is doing. Partly because for some, maybe there's a romanticized view of Hamas as a resistance movement, and they are the people who are fighting occupation, whether we like it or not. What do you make of how the Palestinian diaspora and how Palestinians around the world are reacting to Hamas? Because there's a big debate about, well, before October the 7th, Hamas wasn't that popular in Gaza, according to the polling. Israel's attack has actually made Hamas more popular than they were. I'm just wondering what your own relationship as a Palestinian Christian in the diaspora is to Hamas.
I mean, I would just start by, like, it is understandable how people feel about Hamas in the sense that they feel that it's not something that they want to criticize. Although I do criticize Hamas, but I understand it, because the thing is, people want you to criticize Hamas so that you can use it out of context in cherry-picking way and just completely delegitimize the entire Palestinian struggle. And I make it absolutely clear, Mehdi, as you know, that the main issue here is not Hamas. The main issue is an occupation. The main issue that our people, for more than 75 years, have been ethnic cleansed, have been killed, have been displaced, their private property has been confiscated. That is the cause issue that even produced Hamas and other movements. However, Hamas is problematic. Hamas is problematic for two reasons, from my point of view as Palestinian and as a Christian. Obviously, as a Palestinian, it's problematic because it does not fulfill my aspiration for a democracy, for human rights, for a state that I want that it is not dictatorship. And we experienced in Gaza really an oppressive regime of Hamas, not against the Israelis, but against the Palestinians. You are not free to express your freedom politically, but also you're not free to express your opinion when it comes to just civil rights issues, such as religious, etc. But it's also problematic when it commits war crimes against Israelis. And we have to say it. Killing Israeli civilians is not okay. And Palestinians were never okay with that historically. So this is a foreign thing to us. And I understand how people respond to it when they are grieving. But I really have no room to sympathize with other people when they're killed. But I still criticize them.
Well said. Last year, your permit to go back to the occupied West Bank was revoked while you were here in the States, which is, again, another indication of the impact of occupation, of apartheid. You know, how can you, as a Palestinian, be prevented to going back to where you're from? We now have this week Benjamin Netanyahu playing the role of weatherman with a little stick on television, showing a map of the region, of the country, of Israel, in which the West Bank is completely gone, just erased, swallowed up by Israel. Do you find it ironic living here in the US, where politicians get very worked up about placards on campus saying, river to the sea, you're erasing Israel, Palestinians want to wipe Israel off the map, and yet the Israeli Prime Minister is literally wiping Palestine off the map, and the American government is saying nothing?
It's absolutely a bizarre thing. And in reality, the West Bank has been wiped off. Technically speaking, the Israeli military is all over the West Bank, can go over whenever they want. But not only the Israeli military, it's more problematic what's happening in terms of the colonization, the settlements enterprise. I can tell you that I was surprised to meet Americans here in America who can go and live in the West Bank. Jewish Americans live in my own private property in the West Bank, next to where I used to live in Ramallah, or next to where I went to college in Bethlehem. They can go, they can own the land, they can live there. And someone like myself, who grew up in Gaza, moved to the West Bank in 2009, and all of a sudden, they revoked my permit to go back. Do you know, Mehdi, that if you're a Palestinian Christian or a Muslim from Gaza, there is a very high chance that you would never see the West Bank or know how it looked like. It was my first time to see a mountain in 2009 when I got to the West Bank. And I moved there, and I was considered by Israeli law as an illegal alien until 2017. They granted me the permit, and it's a yearly permit, and then all of a sudden they revoked it.
You are quite outspoken here in Washington, D.C. You've mentioned before how since October the 7th, quote, a lot of organizations that had Palestinians and Israelis working together in the grassroots have completely collapsed. You also said there's no hope for a two-state solution unless there's mutual acceptance of two peoples. Given everything that's happened since October the 7th, just this week, Yair Golan, one of the Israeli opposition leaders, said two-state solution is not happening anytime soon, if at all. Do you still think that acceptance can be achieved, coexistence can be achieved, or has this war, this genocide, the post-October 7th violence and bloodshed, has that put a nail in the coffin of a two-state solution?
I think the nail was put before even the genocide. I think the nail was when this last Israeli government came to power with a clear agenda that they want to ethnic cleanse the Palestinians, that they want to instigate any war in order to wipe the Palestinians off the map, to get rid of them in the West Bank. And it's unfortunate that what so-called peace activism industry that I used to be part of for years, Mehdi, has completely ignored all this asymmetry of power. And they are just talking about, let's get together. Yeah, and let's get together. And I spent more than 7 years believing in that theory of change. Like, if we just get together, if we just explain to them, they will understand. But at the end of the day, Mehdi, and I've been to many, I no longer believe it. Because I've got too many meetings. I've got to speak to them. They've listened to me. We get to see each other reality. But at the end of the day, I'll go back to the apartheid regime that I'm living under, and they'll go back and live a comfortable life under an ethno-democracy that they live under. So I no longer believe in this. I still believe in the mutual acceptance of each other, but it cannot come at the expense of the Palestinians when one side have to acknowledge the other, but the other side is literally doing everything it can to wipe us off the map. So no, I don't believe in that. And I can tell you the following. I talked to many Palestinian peace activists who work in these industries, many of which, by the way, is funded by Western governments. And they tell me the following. They tell us we are no longer believing that, and we are forced to stay because we just need our salary during this bad economy. And it's a really shameful thing that we are still believing in theories of change that has proven to be a failure.
Sadly, indeed, they have. Khalil Sayegh, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I appreciate this conversation.
Thank you for having me, Mehdi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It would have been the end of any other candidate's campaign, but it was Donald Trump. And so, of course, he's gotten away with it. Again, I am, of course, talking about the controversy surrounding Donald Trump's visit to Arlington National Cemetery, which we still need to talk about and which actually does really matter. The Trump campaign claims their candidate was invited to an event marking the 3rd anniversary of the Kabul airport attack that killed 13 US service members in 2021. Although it wasn't some sort of official event, but a private family gathering. Cemetery staff explained the ground rules. After all, it's illegal to hold political campaigns and election-related activities within Army National Military cemeteries. They added that no campaign photographer could be used at Section 60, the location of the recent American war dead. But as we now know, Trump, surprise, had no intention of honouring those legal restrictions. Defying defence officials, Trump brought along campaign aides, including a campaign photographer and a videographer who tried to follow Trump while he visited the veterans' graves. And when a staff member at Arlington Cemetery, a military official, stepped in to stop the photo op, they were subjected to verbal abuse from the Trump campaign staff. The confrontation soon became violent, with a campaign aide pushing the cemetery staff member to one side, insisting that cameras were allowed. Now, imagine the media circus if it had been Kamala Harris or Tim Walz doing this. But Trump apparently has a free pass. And not only that, but some in the media repeated the demonstrably false claim that this was an event that Biden or Harris had somehow missed. When it comes to accountability, Trump tried blaming the families who invited him for the footage that his own campaign released, and even called the whole thing a setup. Trump, of course, has form when it comes to disrespecting dead American soldiers and their families. In 2016, Trump infamously berated the Gold Star parents of Captain Humayun Khan, who was killed during the Iraq War in 2004. After Khizr and Khan spoke at the Democratic National Convention and spoke about their son's sacrifice compared to Donald Trump's lack of sacrifice, Trump accused them of being Democratic Party plants and made Islamophobic remarks about Ghazala Khan. Khizr Khan joins me now. Thank you so much for coming on the show, coming on Mehdi Unfiltered this week. We appreciate it. You and I last spoke back in 2016 when Trump was attacking you back then. Your son Humayun is buried at the Arlington National Cemetery that Trump visited. What was going through your mind as you saw the initial news coverage and campaign videos that emerged from that visit?
Well, I was disgusted and saddened, but not surprised. This is and this continues to be expected from Trump. He creates controversy, he creates divisions. I have been going to Arlington Cemetery prior to Humayun's burial. Then I used to go just to pay respect, but thereafter we have been going there to visit Humayun and other heroes that are buried there. I have never found, I must speak for Arlington Cemetery staff, them out of order. They are extremely courteous, extremely mindful of the dignity of the place and the dignity of their position, why they are there. So I was saddened, disgusted, but not surprised.
So as someone who's been going there for years, both before and after your own son's death, would you describe what you saw Trump doing as campaign-related activity? Because that's what's prohibited by federal law, political campaigning, election-related activities. Is that what it looked like to you?
Well, it of course does, not only to me, but to the entire world. It looks as if he was using that moment for campaign activity.
Yep. They put out a video afterwards.
Exactly.
On their own feed.
Yeah.
He did a photo with a thumbs up. I don't know who does a thumbs up at a graveside. You mentioned the staff being, well regarded. A cemetery staffer was reportedly verbally abused and pushed to the side when they tried to prevent Trump's team from taking photos in Section 60, this part of the section that's reserved for veterans who died in Iraq, Afghanistan, like your son. How do you think it is that Donald, you've been following this guy for nearly a decade, you've been going back and forth since 2016, how is he able to get away with even this? This would destroy any other candidate, a Mitt Romney, a John McCain, a Barack Obama. This would destroy them.
I am not surprised. There is a segment in our society that thrives on such controversies, divisions, and hate, and that is what is his support, and that is where he gets his strength. Had there been anyone else, as you so well said, that candidate would have been. But this is not first time.
Yeah.
Remember in 2018, November 2018, when he was in France to participate in the commemoration of 100th anniversary of end of World War I, he said, to me, these are suckers and these are losers.
Yes, and he got away with that.
Then comes 2017. In 2017, standing in same Section 60 with then his Secretary of Homeland, later on General Kelly became his Chief of Staff. He asks at the grave site of young Lieutenant Kelly, General Kelly is a Gold Star father as well. He says, what is in it for them? As if he's totally void of the respect, the realization of sacrifice and the place of
which he is
of these heroes. He's the same Trump that on August 12 in 2017, when Charlottesville was attacked, and he said when asked, well, would you condemn the violence that took place in Charlottesville? He says, Well, there are good people on both sides.
They're very fine people on both sides, which they're now trying to rewrite and say, oh, he wasn't referring to the Nazis, even though there were only Nazis on one side. Just to come back to what happened at Arlington Cemetery, we know that the staff member at Arlington, who the Trump campaign called, quote, a despicable individual, and they claim she has mental health issues. She was later afraid to press charges against her attacker. We don't know who that is yet on the Trump campaign. She was afraid to press charges out of fear of retaliation from Trump's supporters. You have been a target of Trump and his supporters in the past. What is it like to be attacked by Donald Trump and his campaign and his army of supporters nationwide? What is that like, the retaliation, the intimidation?
Well, it is concerning. We were concerned about our personal safety, about safety of our family, our children, myself, and Ghazala, of course. But Mehdi, I want your audience to remember this. There is a vast majority in this country that had supported us, that stood with us, shook our hands, met at airports, in shopping malls, just now coming up in this building, a strange lady, she said, Mr. Khan, I recognize you, stay strong.
Wow.
It is that is, and I ask one question of the entire America, would you hire a person of Donald Trump's caliber and convictions and indictments, 34 felonies, to protect your family?
Yeah.
And I ask Republicans, what a regrettable legacy they have built in the last 3 elections.
Yeah.
That's all they have. Republicans are as patriotic as anyone else.
You used to support Ronald Reagan in the 80s,
Exactly.
And now you're looking at a Republican Party that, as you say, insults the military, disrespects the dead, attacks Gold Star parents.
Is that what they have got, that for last 3 elections they keep nominating him, bringing him up as their candidate? This is a regrettable, in 234-year history of United States, there had not been a president or a former president who had been indicted, convicted of felonies.
I'm sure in 2016, when you were speaking at the DNC, you didn't imagine you'd be here in 2024, still making the case against Trump. Just broadly on Arlington Cemetery, before we finish, does the incident there show that stronger policies are needed to prevent these locations from being co-opted into a glorified campaign stop? I mean, John McCain also in 2008 used Arlington in a campaign ad back then. He, at least, unlike Trump, apologized immediately after he was called out for it. But it feels like we need stronger rules. I mean, it's already against the law. What else can be done to prevent this stuff from happening?
Well, I don't think it's a matter of rules. It's a matter of personal decency. And Trump is void of accountability, sense of responsibility. That is why we see that civility in our political discourse is at its lowest.
Yes.
We are supposed to be the model. Our democracy was supposed to be a model for the rest of the world. But because of one person in this presidential campaign, discourse of civility in our political discourse is at lowest. It's regrettable.
Yes.
So rules are there. We all follow those rules. When I go to visit Arlington Cemetery, I am mindful of, I have my pass in my car, I have my driver's license as my ID ready. They check it, they thank us, and they guide us where to go and all this. So it is up to a person, and it is a personal decency of which Trump is void.
Indeed. One final question. In 2004, you did lose your son, Humayun, during the Iraq War, a war that many of us think should never have been launched in the first place. 20 years later, we are seeing the US supporting Israel, which is committing, in the view of many, a genocide in Gaza, risking a wider regional war in the Middle East that America could be dragged into against Iran, troops, aircraft, etc. With this election only a few months away, and given what we've seen from Trump and his hawkishness in the past, given what we've seen from the Biden administration's strong support for Israel, what is your message? You're a Democrat now. You've been participating in the party. What is your message as a Democrat to your party candidate, to Kamala Harris, as a Gold Star parent? What do you think she should be doing to prevent more people from dying in the Middle East in an unnecessary war?
I think you said it so rightly that this policy should be reviewed, should be looked at from the interest of United States perspective. Every life, Mehdi, in my belief, in my personal commitment, has equal dignity. We don't differentiate between nationalities, colors, origins, and all. Each and every life is sacred. Each and every life has equal dignity. I leave it there. Loss of life is regrettable, and I hope, I'm sure, as much as I know Kamala Harris, she is a compassionate person. She realizes and she sees the harm to America's interest, American policy, and human life. Hopefully it will be reviewed and revisited.
Khizr Khan, we will have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's our show. Mehdi Unfiltered will be back next week. In the meantime, do make sure you subscribe to Zeteo. For now, from me, goodbye. Did you like this video? Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel and turn on notifications. For exclusive content and to support our independent, unfiltered journalism, head over to zeteo.com. Your support matters.